Before America taxed your paycheck, it taxed your fortune. Every dollar, every bond, every share of stock. In the year 1902, local governments across the United States collected almost as much revenue as the federal and state governments combined, not through income taxes, not through tariffs, but through something far more direct, a system called the general property tax. It was the tax that reached into vaults, into safes, into the hidden ledgers of America's rising millionaires. Imagine a world where every banker, every railroad tycoon, every factory owner was required to list everything they owned, from their mansions and land, to their shares in steel companies, to their cash, even the debts others owed them. That list wasn't just for show. It was the basis of a tax bill, a tax on total wealth. This was the United States of the late 19th century, a nation built on expansion, ambition, and inequality. And this tax was its invisible regulator. By 1893, the state of Michigan had passed the General Property Tax Act. It was one of the most ambitious pieces of financial legislation in American history. It declared that all property, tangible or intangible, would be taxed according to its value. That included stocks, bonds, and corporate equity, the lifeblood of the new industrial elite. At that time, such laws weren't rare, they were standard. Every major state from Ohio to Pennsylvania to Virginia imposed similar taxes. By the 1,922nd, general property tax collections equaled nearly 5% of America's GDP. That's a level modern property taxes would struggle to match. The system financed America's rise, building schools, roads, and cities that would power the Industrial Revolution. The money came not from the poor or the middle class, but from the great accumulations of private wealth that defined the Gilded Age. But as America's fortunes grew, so did its ability to hide them. The general property tax worked in a world of farms, factories, and visible goods, but it struggled in a world of paper, wealth stocks, bonds, and the unseen capital flowing through Wall Street. Millionaires learned that the easiest way to escape taxation was not to refuse it, but to disappear from it. They shifted wealth into invisible forms, assets that assessors couldn't find, couldn't value, couldn't prove. And as that happened, the cracks began to show. Economists called the system archaic. Politicians said it was inefficient. The rich called it unfair. But the truth was simpler. The general property tax was working too well. It was taxing the untaxable, reaching into the financial shadows where the new power of America lived. Soon, whispers spread through universities and state houses alike. The system had to change. It was outdated, corrupt, impossible to enforce. But was it really? Or had the powerful simply discovered a way to make their wealth invisible, to shift the burden onto the workers, the farmers, and the small business owners who couldn't hide what they owned? The general property tax wasn't just a system. It was a mirror one that reflected America's deepest fear, that true equality might come with a price. So the system began to fade, quietly, piece by piece. By the early 1900s, it was already dying, and by mid-century, it was gone. But why did America abandon a tax that could reach the unreachable? Why erase a tool that once held its wealthiest citizens accountable? To understand why, we need to go back in time, to the moment when America's most powerful decided that their fortunes would never again be seen. The story begins in the ashes of the Civil War. A divided nation was rebuilding itself not just politically, but financially. In 1865, the United States emerged into a new kind of capitalism. Railroads stitched the country together. Steel magnates, oil barons, and bankers were creating fortunes on a scale never seen before. Cities like New York, Chicago, and Detroit exploded with wealth and inequality. But here's the twist. America didn't yet have an income tax. The federal government lived off tariffs and excise duties. The rich paid nothing on what they earned, only on what they owned. And what they owned was taxed under the general property tax. Every acre of land, every locomotive, every bond and promissory note. Every dollar of intangible property was part of the taxable base. If you were wealthy in 1870, your wealth wasn't invisible. It had a price tag, and it was public record. In the South, before emancipation, even enslaved people had been counted as taxable property. When slavery was abolished, the taxable base of those states collapsed, proof that this system had once treated human beings as part of economic capital. The moral stain of that fact would haunt the tax's legitimacy for decades. Still, the general property tax powered America's first great boom. By the 1,852nd, it generated about 2% of the nation's GDP. By the 1,922nd, that figure had risen to nearly 5%. Local governments were flush with cash building schools, public roads, and courthouses. The wealth of the rich paid for the rise of the middle class. But beneath the numbers, tension was growing. As the economy industrialized, the definition of property began to change. No longer just fields or factories, wealth now lived in paper, in credit, in shares of corporate stock. These were assets with no physical presence. You couldn't see them, measure them, or even know they existed without a banker's ledger. And that was the problem. Assessors in Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania tried to track this new kind of wealth. They issued questionnaires demanding disclosure of every dollar, every certificate, every IOU. But the rich stopped answering truthfully. They lied, they hid, they moved their money into trusts, shell companies, and out-of-state banks. By 1893, Michigan passed its General Property Tax Act, reaffirming that all property, tangible or intangible, must be taxed at its fair market value. It was an act of defiance, a stand against secrecy. But it came too late. Industrial America was already building an empire of invisibility. By the turn of the century, tax compliance had collapsed. Wealth that once funded schools now sat untaxed in brokerage accounts. Local officials warned of disappearing revenues. The very foundation of the system, voluntary honesty, was crumbling. And in the smoke-filled rooms of universities and think tanks, a new movement began. Economists, lawyers, and the business elite called for a modern solution. The general property tax, they said, was outdated, a relic of an agricultural age. They were right about one thing. America was changing. But they were wrong about what it meant. The truth was, the rich had found a way to make wealth untouchable, to transform taxable property into invisible power. What began as a system to make everyone pay their fair share was becoming a game only the wealthy could win. And soon, their revolt would become law. By the 1,890 seconds, America's millionaires had learned a powerful secret. You didn't have to fight the tax man. You just had to outgrow him. Their wealth was no longer measured in acres or machines. It was measured in paper certificates, bonds, trusts, and corporate shares, stored in vaults and safe deposit boxes. Invisible assets in an age that still thought of property as something you could touch. The general property tax, designed in a world of wagons and farmland, couldn't keep up with an economy of ledgers and signatures. And the men who profited from that gap, bankers, industrialists, and investors, were about to turn the system inside out. One of their intellectual champions was Edwin R. A. Seligman, a Columbia University economist, born in 1861 to one of New York's wealthiest merchant families. In 1890, Seligman published a paper that would become a manifesto for the new rich. He called the general property tax a premium on dishonesty, the cause of such crying injustice that its abolition must become the battle cry of every statesman and reformer. His argument was seductive. He claimed the tax was unfair because it couldn't be enforced equally. The poor couldn't hide their land, but the rich could hide their assets. And rather than fix the system, he proposed something radical: abolish it. Replace it with a tax on income, a system that taxed earnings, not ownership. The wealthy applauded. Because an income tax could be shaped, minimized, deferred, property couldn't. Behind Seligman's crusade were forces far larger than academia. The financial elite had begun funding campaigns to replace the property tax. They funded studies, newspapers, and even political candidates who promised modernization. By 1913, they got their wish. The 16th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified, granting Congress the power to lay and collect taxes on incomes from whatever source derived. It was hailed as a victory for fairness. Progressives celebrated it as a tool to rein in inequality. But in practice, it became something else. The general property tax was local and visible. People knew who paid and how much. The new income tax was federal and distant, complicated, technical, and filled with loopholes that only the wealthy could afford to navigate. By the 1,930 seconds, the property tax had collapsed under the weight of evasion. In Michigan, once the model of comprehensive taxation, enforcement was nearly impossible. States struggled to even locate intangible assets. Compliance rates dropped so low that by mid-century, the tax on intangible property became negligible. The revolt of the rich wasn't violent. It was bureaucratic, invisible. They had turned the weapon of law into a shield. The public saw reform. The elite saw liberation. What followed was the slow death of America's only true wealth tax. And with its death came the birth of a new order, an era where fortunes could grow forever without ever being touched. But here's the truth history books rarely mention. The fall of the general property tax wasn't a failure of fairness. It was a triumph of invisibility. The rich didn't destroy the system because it was broken. They destroyed it because it worked. By the early 20th century, the transformation was complete. America had entered a new era, the age of the invisible fortune. The general property tax, once the backbone of public finance, was dissolving not by law, but by design. The mechanism was subtle, elegant, and devastatingly effective. It began with a redefinition: what counted as property. In 1893, Michigan's General Property Tax Act had made the answer simple: everything. Cash, land, livestock, stocks, bonds, debts owed, even rights to future income. All of it was taxable. But by 1940, that same law had been amended beyond recognition. States introduced lower rates for intangibles, 0.1% on the face value, or 3% of income produced. For building society shares, it fell to 0.04%, a whisper of its former power. The justification was always the same: to improve compliance. But in truth, it was surrender. Assessors couldn't find what they couldn't see. The wealth of the modern age was no longer on land ledgers or factory floors. It lived inside paper and ink. Economist Joseph Thorndike later wrote that the general property tax was a tax ill-suited to a world chock full of intangible property, but not yet endowed with a reliable means of making that property visible. Visibility, that was the key. When money became invisible, power did too. By the 1,930 the richest Americans had turned their wealth into what accountants called intangibles, assets that existed in records, not reality. They were impossible to measure and easy to hide. So the tax collectors simply gave up trying. And as local governments lost the ability to track that wealth, something else quietly replaced it: the income tax and the sales tax. They were new, efficient, and predictable. But they were also regressive, designed for the masses, not the millionaires. Every paycheck, every purchase, every sale was taxed at the source. Ordinary citizens became the backbone of the tax system, while those who lived off investments watched their obligations vanish into accounting smoke. By 1965, Duke University economist John O. Blackburn declared that taxing intangible property had become of negligible importance. 14 states, from Florida to Pennsylvania, still clung to remnants of the old system, but one by one they repealed them. The mechanism was complete. In less than 50 years, America had inverted its tax structure. The wealthy no longer paid based on what they owned. The working class paid based on what they earned. A silent revolution waged through paperwork. Yet even as the old system vanished, a deeper pattern emerged. Every time wealth became invisible, inequality surged. Every time a government stopped taxing property, it started taxing people. The general property tax wasn't a relic. It was a warning proof that financial invisibility isn't progress. It's power, disguised as efficiency. And the irony? The tools that once failed the system, the lack of visibility, the limits of data, no longer exist. In the digital age, every asset leaves a trail. Every share, every bond, every transaction can be tracked. The world that killed the general property tax no longer exists, but the system that replaced it still does, protecting wealth while taxing work. A century after the general property tax vanished, its shadow lingers. Today, America taxes work, not wealth. The middle class bears the burden through property taxes, while the rich shelter fortunes in untaxed assets, stocks, bonds, private equity. Once, local governments thrived on taxing wealth. Now towns struggle, schools crumble, and billionaires escape scrutiny. The same digital tools that made wealth invisible could restore transparency, yet political will is lacking. The result? Unprecedented inequality, reminiscent of the Gilded Age. The general property tax wasn't a failure, it was a warning. When the richest are accountable, power is checked. That moment faded, but hidden wealth cannot stay invisible forever. Power must pay.